Picture this. You've just written a poem. Congrats, by the way. You finish that last line and you close your notebook, shut your laptop, and continue going about your day. Maybe later on you'll show this poem to your friends and family, and maybe even submit it to a literary magazine for publication. Except there's only one tiny little problem. What you've written isn't actually a poem. It's only a draft of one, and you can't tell the difference. The publishers and editors can, though, and so you continue to receive rejection after rejection for your work. I'm a published poet now, but what I just described to you used to be my experience every single time I would write something. Tough, I know. See, once upon a time, I had an unfortunate aversion to editing, and I didn't even know it. I would get so excited at the idea of a finished piece that I would essentially allow my work to cosplay as a finished poem. Ultimately looking at my draft and saying, she's really good, and then immediately sending it to publishers. The worst part was I didn't even know I was doing this, and that's the case for a lot of poets. Well, after gaining years of experience, 45 plus publications under my belt, and overall just becoming a chronic poet, thanks for your condolences. Now, I don't consider a poem finished until it's undergone these 5 editing hacks. Think essentials you don't leave the house without. Your wallet, your shoes, that coveted brown Labubu that you somehow got your hands on. My poems don't leave the house, so to speak, without these 5 things.
What 5 things?
Oh yeah, I was just about to tell them. Yeah, but I mean, thanks for asking. Hack number 1. In a separate document, usually I call this the title of the poem revision lab, I make what I like to call an imagery x-ray of the poem. Now you might be saying, huh? But just let me explain. Oftentimes you can break poems down into recurring images, and these create things called motifs. My goal here is to create a visual map of these patterns in my poem to make sure the anatomy of my poem is cohesive. I'll choose a color for each different type of image or motif that pops up in the poem and highlight where it appears. What I have now is a more holistic view of the poem's structure. Now I mentioned this in my How to Write Better Poetry video. When I do introduce certain types of images, do they continue to reappear throughout the poem, or do they fall off the face of the earth? But an example of inconsistent imagery in a poem would be something like this. I just wrote something up really quick to demonstrate this. So on a literal level, the poem is talking about a mom and her child, the speaker, growing apart. And we can see the literal descriptions of this scene highlighted in yellow. But poems work on multiple levels. So what about the figurative imagery around it? Immediately we see a lot of references to wind and nature, a couple little sprinkles of alchemy and gold. But what about these lines here? Well, we're still describing the same thing literally. The speaker feels like she can't connect with her mother, but our figurative imagery all of a sudden references gears and a locked safe. The sudden and dense inclusion of this type of mechanical lockbox imagery comes in only to then disappear in the final 5 lines. Now let's look at an example of a good imagery x-ray. This is a poem by Ocean Vuong that I show briefly in my other video. He manages to juggle so many different types of images in a single poem, and it's because of how meticulously he interweaves each one. Sure, some may have a more dominant presence in the poem than others, but it still creates a satisfying and balanced tapestry of motifs. I want to be clear though, there are so many different structures that a poem can have, but the main things to look out for in editing are stray lines or verses that get dropped into the poem without any connective tissue or suddenly disappear. So going back to this example, if this was the x-ray of a draft that I wrote, how would I go about editing it? Well, one option is to edit out the mechanical imagery altogether. But what if I don't want to remove it? Another solution would be to sprinkle in some more mechanical images towards the start of the poem, or alternatively, maybe include something like a windmill here, which is both mechanical and wind related, and would thus balance out the sudden inclusion of gears in this second half of the poem. Your mind turning like the gears of a windmill, blowing me further away from you. Now you can play around with it, but essentially this technique allows you to view the structure of your poem with more clarity and refine that structure. Step 2 is going to be a similar mapping technique as step 1, but instead of mapping imagery, we're going to be looking at concrete versus figurative language. Now every poet has their own preference when it comes to the ratio of literal to figurative language in a poem. Some like more straightforward storytelling with moments of figurative flair sprinkled throughout. Others like their poems to live in this more figurative, ambiguous space, with the occasional concrete detail to ground and guide the reader. And some people like half and half. By underlining figurative imagery, it once again gives you a visual indicator of where your poem falls on that spectrum, and how much clarity versus ambiguity it might have to other readers. Now, me personally, I know I have a tendency to get excited and get caught up in figurative language in a poem. Just ask my MFA advisor. I am way more drawn to ambiguous poetry, both reading it and writing it. But this also means that I'll oftentimes have to go back to my drafts and find places where it's just a sea of underlined text, step back and say, okay, here is a good place to put a literal detail, something tangible that the reader can grasp onto. So they're not just like floating and, you know, being like,
what? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Editing tip number 3 is a simple but important one, and that's cutting unnecessary repetition. Repetition is a tricky one. It might sneak up on you when you least expect it. I'm not just talking about like genuinely repeated lines. A lot of times you'll have phrases or lines in your poems where, if you really think about it, one line can be inferred from the other. And there's nothing worse in poetry, in my opinion, than over-explaining. So what I'll do is I'll go through and any phrases or lines that I think are communicating a relatively similar thing, I'll ask myself, can the reader more or less infer the second line from the first line? And if this is the case, I'll usually just let the lines battle it out. Which one is the better contestant? And then the other one, get out of here.
America has voted. The winner of the $1 million and the star of the headline show in Las Vegas is...
Less is always better, and you never want to over-explain. Like, needlessly over-explaining is never something you'd want to do. See what I mean? Editing tip number 3, you can already tell, is going to be a little bit controversial. I'm going to say a hot take, okay? Just stay with me. The problem with thesaurus is not the source itself. It's the fact that people are using it incorrectly. I'm of the opinion that you should never use thesaurus to replace words in your draft with vocab that's more obscure in an effort to sound more poetic. However, there are so many other useful reasons why a poet might choose to swap out a word in their draft with a synonym for that word. And that essentially comes down to rhythm as well as assonance and consonance, so repeated sounds in a poem. The way a poem reads rhythmically and phonetically is pretty important to the poem and does have a big impact on the first impression that an editor may have of your work. What I'll do is I'll go through and underline words that I think are actively disrupting the flow and sound of the poem when I read it aloud. This might be because they have too many syllables, too few syllables, or maybe the sounds in the word clash with the text. And I'll essentially use the source to remind myself of other options for that word. I'll put these other options in parentheses right next to the original word and reread the line out loud, using each of these different synonyms to see which one complements the flow of the poem the most. You'd be surprised at how much this elevates the impression that your poem gives your reader. So before I share my 5th and final editing tip, this would be a great time to like the video if you found any of this advice helpful, and, you know, comment if you're feeling crazy. It really helps people see my content. And of course, subscribe if you want to see more poetry related videos. My 5th and final tip is to explore different formatting options for your text. Hyper traditionalists, you may want to close your ears for this one. I always love to try out different ways to format my poem because space, indentation, and shape are all, in my opinion, great ways of emphasizing and mirroring the message that your poem intends to convey. If you want to hear me talk more about how authors have experimented with formatting in their work, go check out my video on experimental poetry. But essentially, this just comes down to things like, do you want your text to be rigid and brittle because the poem is about confinement and you would have this very traditional looking, strictly left adjusted sort of text? Or do you want it to be scattered across the page and create sort of this chaotic, elusive feeling to the text? Is there a point in the poem where you want the reader to take a breather or maybe to indicate the passage of time? And you could do that through indentation. Subtleties like that really hit home the atmosphere and intention of your poem. This is not to say that you should have this like crazy formatting for all of your poetry. A lot of poems work well with just a left adjusted, simplistic sort of look. My point is only to consider it as part of your editing process. If the formatting were to mirror the content, the message of your poem, what would it look like? And when you actually execute that formatting, does it look right, or does it make you want to throw up and hit backspace a million times? It's all up to you. I hope y'all enjoyed this brief craft video. I've been looking through all of the poetry challenges that you guys have been sending in since my last video and have been loving how creative those are. For those of you who missed the announcement, there is a link to a Google form down in the description of this video where you can submit your most challenging, unhinged poetry prompt ideas for me to attempt in future videos once we get enough submissions. So make sure to check that out if you have any ideas. We've already done a couple poetry challenges on this channel. Yeah, that's it for this video. See y'all next time.